In this video, we figure out what happens if we change the supply curve, the demand curve, or both. Let's imagine that we start at some point A, which we get by finding where the demand and supply curve intersect. This point A corresponds to an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Let's now consider what happens if we decrease demand. We move from the old demand curve to the new demand curve, where the new demand curve represents a decrease. The reason the new demand curve represents a decrease is for any given price, quantity is lower on the new demand curve than it is for the old demand curve. Now, if we decrease demand, we move from point A to point B. Our equilibrium point goes from A to B. And you should be able to see that B is lower on both the price and quantity axis than A is. So a decrease in demand decreases the equilibrium price and decreases the equilibrium quantity. Now let's imagine we do the reverse. We increase demand. Well, now if you increase demand, we raise the equilibrium price and we raise the equilibrium quantity, as shown in the graph in front of you. Now let's consider a decrease in supply. We move from the old supply curve to the new supply curve. Now the new supply curve is lower. That represents a decrease because if you pick any given price, quantity is lower on the new supply curve than the old supply curve. So as you should be able to see from the diagram in front of you, when we decrease supply, we move from equilibrium point A to equilibrium point B. That's where the new intersection is. And B, compared to A, has a higher price but a lower quantity. So a decrease in supply increases equilibrium price but decreases equilibrium quantity. Unsurprisingly, if we increase supply, we move from A to B, and now at B we have a lower price but we're at a higher equilibrium quantity. Now let's go totally crazy and increase demand and supply at the exact same time. It appears from what I've done in the diagram in front of you that price stays the same, but quantity goes up. Unfortunately, there are different ways of drawing what happens when you increase demand and supply. The way I did it in this diagram, you can see, although quantity is still increased, now price is decreased. Remember, in the last diagram, price stayed the same. And here we see yet a third way of showing what might happen if we increase demand and supply. Now, while quantity has still gone up, as it did in the other two examples, now price has actually gone up as well. So what really happens if we increase demand and supply? Is it unknowable? Is this beyond the grasp of economics to figure this one out? Let's consider a much simpler problem. There are two people pushing a giant beach ball. If both people push the beach ball to the right, the ball is going to go to the right. And if these two people both push the ball to the left, the ball will move to the left. Now here's where it gets exciting. What if the two men are pushing the ball in opposite directions? What's going to happen? There are three possibilities. First, the two men could be of equal strength and the ball doesn't move. They cancel each other out. Second, the guy pushing left is stronger and the ball moves left. And third, the guy pushing right is stronger, so the ball moves right. To generalize, if there are two forces acting on an object and those two forces are acting in the same direction, we know that object's going to move in the same direction. But if the two forces are operating in opposite directions, then there are three possibilities. The object doesn't move, it moves to one side, or it moves to the other. So what happens to equilibrium price and quantity if we increase both supply and demand? Well, now we have two forces operating on two things. So from what we've learned, if both forces on a thing are moving in the same direction, that thing will move in that direction. But if the forces are operating in opposite directions, we can't be sure. Our first step in determining what happens if we increase both demand and supply is to see how each force pushes price and quantity. So if we increase demand, that leads to an increase in price and an increase in quantity. So if you think of demand as a guy, when we increase demand, it's a guy pushing up price and pushing up quantity. Now, if you increase supply, that causes a decrease in price, but an increase in quantity. So again, if we think of this increase of supply as a person, that's a person pushing down price, but pushing up quantity. Let's put this information all together. If we increase demand and supply, we see that the increase in demand causes an increase in price, but the increase in supply causes a decrease in price. So these are two forces operating in opposite directions, so we can't be sure what happens. However, both the increase in demand and the increase in supply cause there to be an increase in quantity. So we know unambiguously that quantity goes up. This is why when I drew what happened when I increased supply and demand, I was able to draw it three ways. In one way, the price stayed the same. In another, the price went up. In the third, the price went down. But in all three cases, quantity went up. So what are you supposed to do in general if there's a change in both supply and demand? How are you supposed to figure out what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity? Well, what you shouldn't do is on the same diagram draw two supply and two demand curves and figure out what happens to price and quantity. Because depending upon how you drew the supply and demand curves, you'll get different answers. Instead, what you need to do is first draw a supply and demand curve, then just change the demand curve. That's all. Just change the demand curve, move the demand curve in whatever direction it's supposed to go. Figure out what happens to price and quantity. Then get a whole new diagram, draw a single supply and single demand curve, then just change the supply curve. Figure out from that what happens to price and quantity. Now put all your information together. If the change in supply and change in demand move the price in the same direction, you know price moved in that direction. If, however, they push the price in opposite directions, you don't know what happened. It's possible price goes up, it's possible price goes down, or it's possible the price stays the same. Do the same with quantity. If both the change in supply and demand push the quantity in the same direction, quantity moves in that direction. Otherwise, if they push quantity in opposite directions, you don't know what happens to quantity.